We are used to seeing Rome in movies and textbooks as a city of marble, triumphal arches, and ingenious aqueducts. But the real Rome had a different smell, one that was impossible to endure even for a few minutes. For a modern person, being there would be like being locked in a public toilet at a train station, only without ventilation and for a whole day. The civilization that gave the world roads, laws, and grand arenas lived alongside the filth that was part of its daily life. Public toilets without any partitions. One sponge for hundreds of people. Laundries where slaves washed clothes in vats of urine until their skin was covered with sores. Baths where dirt and the remains of previous bathers floated in the same water. This is no exaggeration. Archaeology shows that along with marble and gold, Rome was riddled with parasites, infections, and a stench that even the incense of the temples could not overcome. Try to imagine it. You are walking through the Forum, the heart of the empire, and the air does not smell of grandeur. It hits your nose with a mixture of slop, rotten fish, and sewage. This was the smell of the power that ruled half the world. Today, we will delve into the darkest side of the Roman Empire. And after this story, you will never be able to think of Rome as a pristine white city again. For the grandeur of this state always went hand in hand with the filth in which it was drowning every day. A morning in Rome could begin with a trip to the public toilet. But don't imagine a modern restroom. Latrines were long stone benches with holes where dozens of people sat side by side without partitions. It looked less like a toilet and more like a market or tavern, only with the smell of sewage. First of all, there was no privacy. You sat next to strangers, and while one moaned with illness, another lively discussed politics. In Rome, even an intimate process became a social event. But the main detail that turns the picture into a nightmare is the sponge on a stick, tersorium. There was only one for everyone. One person used it, rinsed it in a bucket, and passed it on. This is not a legend. Archaeology confirms that hundreds of people shared the same brush every day. In ancient cesspools, archaeologists find the eggs of parasites, nematodes, trichurias, pinworms. In other words, these social clubs were also factories of infections that were transmitted from person to person. It's hard to even imagine. You sit down on a cold stone, next to you is a man in spasms, flies are swarming over the holes, and under the bench flows a stream of sewage that carries everything further down the streets. And to top it all off, you take the same sponge that dozens of people have already used before you. But that's not all. Latrines were dangerous places, and not just for your health. Robbers would sometimes hide in the dark holes. You'd be sitting there, thinking you were safe, and then criminals would jump out at you. The toilet could be a deadly trap. Accidental tragedies were also common. Slaves and children who were forced to clean cesspools risked their lives. The sewers were so dangerous and suffocating that those who found themselves there could simply not get out. Some historians even suggest that archaeological finds may indicate accidental deaths in such places. And then there were spontaneous explosions. Methane accumulated in the closed pits. Sometimes a spark or a lamp would cause a fire, sending a stench and flames into the air. A person could walk into a latrine and witness a sudden flash from below. The rich could afford pots at home, but even there, servants simply emptied them out of the window, sometimes directly onto the heads of passers-by. The poor went to the same public latrines, where they shared stone, smell, and sponges with dozens of strangers. We are afraid of catching an infection even in a modern toilet with antiseptic and paper. In Rome, dozens of people sat side by side on stone benches, using one sponge for everyone. And it was these people who made the laws for the empire. Such was the civilization of Rome. In Rome, even what we consider waste had value. Urine was a raw material for an entire industry. First, it was collected. Buckets were placed throughout the city where anyone could relieve themselves. Slaves collected this resource and carried it to workshops. At this stage, the streets of the capital of the world already stank like a public toilet. But the most disgusting stage awaited in the laundries. Philonikai. Here, slaves literally kneaded clothes with their bare feet in vats filled with urine. Ammonia bleached the fabric, but the smell was so strong that it made your head spin. The skin on the slaves' feet was gradually damaged, but they still trampled on the togas that were later worn by senators. The reality was that a slave stood waist-deep in a vat, forced to knead someone else's clothes step by step in a liquid that had just been collected from the streets. The toga that a senator would wear tomorrow in the Senate was soaked today in what had just been poured out on the corner of an alley. And that's not all. Urine was used as a mouthwash. Ancient texts mention that rinsing your mouth with it was as commonplace as brushing your teeth with toothpaste is for us today. It was even used to treat diseases. Imagine a doctor coming in and saying, "Your wound needs a compress with urine." There was even a whole tax system. Emperor Vespasian taxed this industry. That's when the expression pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, came about. And it wasn't a metaphor, he literally made money from human waste. But social inequality was felt even here. The rich used cleaner batches of urine, which were collected from private homes. The poor were left with the worst, stinking buckets from the streets, where the liquid was mixed with garbage and rot. To avoid taxes, cunning landlords forced their slaves to secretly collect urine at night in taverns and pubs, carrying full buckets in the dark. When they returned home, they were so saturated with the stench that their neighbors turned away from them in the street. Today, we are used to laundry detergents with floral scents. In Rome, clothes were bleached with bare feet in vats of urine, and entire workshops were dedicated to this business. It was a civilization that turned human waste into a commodity, and forced people to live in stench so that the emperor could say, "Money really doesn't smell." Many people imagine Roman baths as marble, steam, and luxury. But in reality, they were more like giant incubators for germs. Before diving into the pool, Romans used a stridulous scraper to remove sweat, dirt, and grease from their bodies. All of this flowed into the water. A murky liquid with a greasy film on the surface was the norm. The baths were also used to treat illnesses, dress wounds, and perform simple medical procedures right next to the pools. All of this mixed with the water used by dozens of people. Historians even suggest that dangerous epidemics, from tuberculosis to the Antonine Plague, may have spread here. It is difficult for modern people to imagine such realities: a pool, murky water, hair and dirt floating on the surface. A slave scrapes his master, oil and sweat flow into the common pool. Next to him, a man with a bandaged leg dives in. It was more like collective infection than relaxation. After gladiator fights, they were washed in the same baths. Dirt from the arena got into the water, and the bathhouse turned into a place where, instead of healing, you could bring home a new disease. There were also instant deaths. Steam rooms were often overheated. People would go in and lose consciousness within minutes from lack of oxygen. Slaves would then carry out the unconscious visitors, and not all of them would regain consciousness. For some, it was a health treatment, for others, a deadly trap. Rome was proud of its roads and sewer system, but as soon as you stepped outside, all that grandeur disappeared. The capital of the empire lived in a constant stench. The first level of horror was night pots. Most Romans did not have toilets, and the contents of the pots were simply poured out of the windows. Imagine, a dark alley, you are walking home, and suddenly a bucket of sewage splashes on your head from the second floor. For us, it would be a disaster. For the Romans, it was as commonplace as morning coffee is for us. The second level was the sewage system, which was unable to cope. The Cloaca Maxima, the pride of Rome, was an engineering marvel, but even it could not withstand the load. The drains overflowed, and the stench hung even in the city center, in the forum itself, where laws were made. Now add to that the liveliness. The streets were swarming with rats rummaging through the garbage. And abandoned children, left to fend for themselves on the roads, a practice known as expositio, often died of hunger or disease. Let's transport ourselves for a moment to that time and place, a narrow street in summer. Underfoot is a black, sticky mess of rotten food and slop. It steams, and flies swarm in clouds. An abandoned infant sits by the wall. And it is here that thousands of inhabitants of the imperial capital pass every day. Night was even more dangerous. In the darkness and stench, people often fell into open sewer manholes. The dead were found only a day later, and this was a common tragedy. And when the neighborhood was on fire, sewage mixed with the flames. The smoke from the fires smelled not only of wood, but also of sewage. Firefighters lost consciousness from the stench that rose with the smoke. The third level, markets and slaughterhouses. Slaughtered animals were butchered right on the street. Blood flowed down the cobblestones, and the remains of carcasses quickly rotted underfoot. And next to this, bread and vegetables were being sold. Instead of the smell of fresh baking, there was a mixture of rot, garbage, and sewage. The rich could still flee to villas on the hills, where the air was cleaner. But the poor lived in insulae, multi-story buildings above the canals, literally breathing sewage fumes around the clock. Think about it for a second. For us, a bucket of trash out the window is a big deal and a scandal. In Rome, a bucket of sewage on your head in the middle of the city was just everyday life. Greatness and stench always went hand in hand there. It was a civilization that lived in its own cesspool, and yet called it eternal. Even the food in Rome was steeped in the same filth and stench that prevailed in its streets. The first level of horror was garum, the Romans' favorite sauce. It was the main condiment for everything from bread to meat and even desserts. It was simple to prepare. Fish entrails were left to rot in huge barrels under the sun. The mixture decomposed for weeks until it turned into a foul-smelling liquid. The smell was so unbearable that even ancient authors complained about the stench that spread through the streets. Despite this, garum was considered a delicacy, and its value could be compared to gold. But the problem was not just the smell. Dishonest sellers often adulterated garum by using poor-quality fish or adding animal remains. This resulted in a dangerous sauce that could cause illness. Some authors even suggested that spoiled garum could have been deliberately used against competitors. There is little direct evidence of this, but the idea itself shows how dangerous this sauce could be. The second level is the location of the markets. Garum and bread sellers stood next to cesspools. Sewage flowed nearby, and flies flew from the filth to the sauce and meat on the counters. The seller scooped garum with a spoon, and a few steps away, sewage flowed. The third level is the atmosphere of the markets. They did not smell of fresh pastries, but of a mixture of rotten fish, rotten vegetables, and animal blood. Meat was often taken not from freshly slaughtered animals, but even from those that had died naturally, in order to make the product cheaper. The poor bought such meat because it was cheaper. Now imagine, you are standing in a Roman market. In front of you is a counter with garum, a thick, dark liquid that stinks so much that your eyes water. Meat covered with flies hangs on hooks nearby. And just a few steps away, sewage flows into a ditch, mixing with fish remains. You swallow a piece of bread, and your mouth is filled with the taste of sewage. The Romans were proud of their delicacies. Today, we would hardly be able to stand even their smell. And at the same time, they paid for garum with gold, risking their lives with every spoonful of this sauce. In Rome, food and filth merged into one, and every meal could be your last. Rome left the world laws, roads, magnificent arenas, and monuments. But alongside this, there was another life that is rarely mentioned. Every day, its inhabitants sat side by side in public toilets, sharing one sponge between hundreds of people. Slaves washed clothes in vats of urine, and their feet slowly rotted away from constant contact with ammonia. In the baths, which were a symbol of luxury, dirt, oil, and the remains of treatments mixed together in the same water. On the streets, buckets of sewage fell on the heads of passers-by, and a black slurry of garbage, debris, and animal blood steamed under their feet. Even food, sauces, meat, fish, stood next to cesspools, and flies carried traces of sewage onto it. Archaeologists find evidence of this even today. Traces of human waste have been preserved in the sewage layers beneath the temples where people prayed to the gods. Water and dirt flowed beneath the same columns that symbolized the greatness of Rome. For the city's inhabitants, this was not a novelty, it was everyday life. Now we see a stark contrast. You are standing in the Forum, where senators decide the fate of the empire. You look up and see marble temples and arches. You look down and see a dark, damp stain from the sewer drain. Two realities that existed side by side and never disappeared without each other. The final chord, grandeur and filth in Rome, did not contradict each other. They were parts of a whole. And perhaps this is what made it truly unique. Because the history of Rome is not only about triumphs and arenas, but also about the everyday life of millions of people. And behind the marble, gold, and laws, there was always another side, daily, repulsive, but inseparable.